So my presentation that I made is based on my senior seminar projects. We had, so a little bit about the project before I start. We had to pick a, my good. Okay, a family project for local history to research and write about. So I figured I'd pick the Graceham Moravians. One, because they're in the area, they're local history, and two, I have some family like ancestry that was a part of the Graceham Moravians in this area. So you can go on to the thesis work. So my thesis for my project was the death practices, sermons, music, and religious beliefs of the community at Graceham provide an understanding of the Moravian conception of death and dying within the 18th and 19th century. And we go to the next one. So a little bit of background about Moravians. They're German pietists, which is part of the Protestant Christianity. The German pietist movement began around the middle of the 1600s by a number of leading Protestant, primarily Lutheran scholars and their students. The man pictured in the background here is Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, which is the main Moravian that we'll be talking about, that really brought the Moravians over into the Americas. And so the Moravians found their head township city in Saxony in Herrenhutz in 1727, and they become the Reformed Unitas Fratrum, or Unity of the Brethren, and they kind of expand out from there. And then in 1741, they established their American headquarters in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is also where I gathered most of my research from, and where we have our translated copies of the diaries from the church. So we can go on to the next one. So a little bit about the religious beliefs of the Moravians. Let me get some notes here. So I gathered most of this information from one of the diaries from Johann Schlegel. So the church was heavily engaged with the community, particularly the sick and the dying and non-believers. And some of their sacraments, the two major ones, was baptism, which they saw as the washing away of sin, and confession of faith, which is really important in their belief. And the other sacrament that wasn't necessarily mentioned in the diaries, but is also very important, is Holy Communion, which is taken every gathering. It just represents God's grace, the sacrifice and salvation for sinners, which they also view as very important to their belief system. They're also very engaged with spreading their faith. They're known for going out into the frontiers, which would have been this area around the time that they come down here in the 1740s. They're just known for spreading their faith to the unbaptized people and non-Christians. And they held great importance of the acknowledgement of sin and God's grace, which can be seen in the next. We have one more religious belief. They also believed in eternal life after death for those who were saved and believe in the Christian faith. They used language to describe death as a journey home, which we'll see later in the presentation. There's a specific passage from one of the documents I found at the Bethlehem, the Moravian archives. And basically, it just shows that world and worldly possessions are only temporary, and eternal salvation is, of course, everlasting. And then, of course, the pastors are really only there to help their congregation develop this relationship with God and the church community. And it's really up to the individual to the extent of that relationship. That's the next one. And for those of you that can see, this is a confession of faith, specifically drawn from one of the documents from 1809. One of the pastors is visiting a dying man who I assume either was not part of the church or had not previously believed in Christianity, because he's, of course, asking him about his confession of his faith. And I'll let you guys read that. So again, this just really shows that, of course, the pastors, especially in this congregation, were very active in the area. I believe this man is from Kriegerstown, that Carl Black is talking to. And of course, this scene would have been prominent throughout the entire area, and probably happened many times, but this is the specific occurrence. And that's probably really consistent. Another part of the Moravians that I looked into, which also played into their death practices, was their music. They were known prominently for their music and using that during their sermons and gatherings. So that includes, they had brass bands, they had hymns that were, they were mainly 16th and 17th century Lutheran hymns that they brought over from Europe, and they continued to use throughout the congregations, even up until the middle of the 1800s. They loved to sing Bible verses, and it was associated with prayer, funerals, and it was really an agent to get that deeper connection, especially for those that couldn't necessarily read and write. They could find a connection to Christ through music. And I listed a few hymns and songs that they would sing. And these specifically come from mentions in the diaries. So here's a couple. And we can switch over. Here are two excerpts from the diaries as well that show this musical connection. The first one, they were visiting I think a sick couple, and they sang together in German and English, because you have to remember that these Moravians are mostly German, and they continue to speak German even up until the middle of the 1800s. And the pastors especially, they had to really switch in between English and German, but German was their prominent language. So there's another way they could connect to different people. And then the second one was, I believe, Schlegel is visiting two women that are very sick. So he's trying to help them be reassured in their faith, and we sing songs, and the people gathered around them. All right, now the practices associated with that. The first one I talked about in my paper was specifically the God's Acre. That's what they call their cemetery. It was really just for the interment of the baptized members and Christian friends of the congregation. There's one person that was from outside the congregation that wasn't baptized, that was allowed to be buried in the cemetery, but I believe he was just a close friend to one of the pastors, so that was allowed. The God's Acre is also a site for the reading of their Easter litany, which they bring out the congregation at dawn, and they basically just sing and read different passages of the Bible, specifically about Christ's passion and his death and resurrection. So it allows them, based on what I got from the diaries, it allowed them a deeper connection to their past congregation members and also to Christ. So just, again, solidifying their belief. Another practice is the reading and writing of a Lebenslauf, which is in English, life's journey or life's passage. And it helps individuals reflect on death and really their life in connection to Christ and to God. And also to teach their congregation members, especially the younger ones, about living piously, which is really a big part of their belief system. And then also the final thing was their word choice reflected acceptance of death and afterlife in heaven as this true residence and place of comfort. And then the physical world was really only temporary. And we'll see that coming up here soon. We can go into the next one. During the 1820s, 1830s, the congregation went through a lot of hardships. The most prominent one, the Samuel Renke, which was the pastor at the time that he wrote about, was lots of diseases. There was a couple epidemics that occurred in this area and throughout the state of Maryland at the time. The first one being in the 1820s, the early 1820s, was a cholera epidemic that he specifically writes about. He doesn't say how many people passed away because of it, but based on some of the documents and the word choice, it seems that there's quite a few. So I was hoping to find a little bit more about the Catoctin furnace to bring in here, but unfortunately I couldn't find anything about the cholera epidemic. During the 1830s, when the scarlet fever came through, it took out 22 members just in 1833, and many of them were children, and Samuel Renke writes about that extensively. And he does mention that he was going to the furnace quite often during this time to help the people here. And you can kind of see that he feels kind of lost a little bit, especially with the other issues that were going on with the congregation, especially drunkenness. There's a man that he talks to quite often. I think his name is John Krieger. He had been expelled from the congregation for drunkenness, and Samuel Renke made it his objective to really bring him back in. And I think he eventually says that he's been reawakened and he's repented. And he comes in and he writes quite a few lines about that too. So not all doom and gloom. And then we can go to the last one here. So this is a translation from the Sterba Register, which means death register in English. So this is about one of the victims of the scarlet fever. And you can kind of see the word choice at the end that they use here, where they say he's going home and he went home happy. So just again, solidifying their belief system. And then conclusion. So even though that death was ever present as in the Moravian life and still is today, it was something that they viewed as celebratory, even if they were mourning, because that meant that they got eternal life in heaven, and as long as they were committed to a life devoted to God, they would all see each other once again. So, and also, a lot of the congregation members are farmers, so I also view it as maybe they were hoping, it gave them some comfort knowing that after a life of toil and hardship, there'll be peace and end. And you get that throughout the diaries and everything. The pastors writing about it, and some of the congregation letters that you guys can visit at the Moravian archives say the same exact thing. So that's really the conclusion, and then my sources at the end. And the translated copies from Edward Quinter that we have here through the Furnace organization really helped a lot. That's really where I got most of my information. So. And that's it.
I have a question.
Yep.